I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Hey, welcome to the show. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson, and I am your host. I'm a naturopathic doctor, and today's conversation about diet is going to blow your mind. It's going to move you from thinking about diet elimination and diet restriction and even just your dietary habits and patterns in a very different way. And I'll say, as a naturopathic doctor, like this as a profession is something that I'm not sure that we come at from always the right angle. So I want to preface this with, I want you to enter this conversation with an open mind. It's funny, nutrition is something where it's almost an identity for people versus other aspects of their healthcare. Although maybe not exercise. I think exercise is also an identity for people. But there's not many other aspects of our life or healthcare that we have such an attachment to as we do our nutrition. And I mean, historically, nutrition was about so much, right? It was about celebration. It was about your culture. There was, this tradition of cuisine. Whereas now, that identity that people, connect with from a health perspective with their nutrition, I feel like is clouded by more than just what our cultural, historic foods were. But it's interesting because it makes this a conversation that is much more emotionally charged than other conversations, right? Like you don't identify as a person who takes vitamin C, right? You don't maybe identify as a person who drinks green tea or who, I don't know. Like I think that when we think about other health patterns and behavior, your diet is something that feels much more like it's part of your identity, especially if it's something that you're working on over time. It is connected to your identity. So as you're listening, I want you to think critically about the choices that you have made with respect to your nutrition. I want you to be able to think critically when you're looking at information presented online about nutrition. I want you to try and have this compassionate curiosity and almost examining your own patterns like a science experiment versus having this, complete emotional attachment to the way it is that you eat or the way it is that you believe that humans should eat. So I'm going to open with that. So come with me on this little discussion or on this journey, but I need you to do it with an open mind. And the reason that I open with that is because I can't think of a conversation that brings up more but Jordan's than talking about nutrition. So when I'm working with someone one-on-one and I say, I want you to include more protein, this is what we're going to shoot for. Immediately the stance that that person takes, even if the reason they're there is to get better, is, but Jordan, I thought having too much protein was bad. But Jordan, I heard eating animals was bad. But Jordan, I watched Forks Over Knives and I think eating animals is bad. But Jordan, I heard this. But Jordan, I heard that. And that's very different. It's a different kind of conversation than me saying, hey, there's this antioxidant CoQ10 and it might help your headaches. I want you to take it, right? It's very rare that I get the level of pushback on the conversation around other things that I do with nutrition. And I think it's because it's not something that we've taught people very well. You've had to pick up information about nutrition from various sources, credible or not. we also have this deep sort of emotional feeling about food. And so it's hard for us to hold our diet out, 4 feet out in front of us and look at it with this level of critique that we should or could, or maybe it would be in our best interest if we did. So that's why I bring that up, because it really is this conversation that I have with patients. The most amount of contrary statements to what I say about a health plan comes up in the conversation around nutrition. So what I want to talk about today is kind of what dietary elimination looks like. What happens when you want to change your diet, right? And so that's kind of the title of the episode is like, if you want to change your diet, here's 3 things you need to think about. And it's common for people when I work with them to say that they'd like to change their nutrition and they haven't gone through these 3 questions. And that's why I think it's such a valuable place for you to start. It's a valuable thing to kind of listen to on your own as you're starting to make that decision about maybe working with someone who could more deeply help you make those transitions. So I want to start by saying that the vast majority of nutrition elimination is not particularly evidence-based. So I'm just going to start with that. So the noise online about take this food out, put this food in general is not particularly evidence-based. And so the decision for you to make shifts and changes to your diet, even if you've decided that that is something that you would like to do, I just want you to remember that most of the things that you have come across just through your reading or through consuming conversations, maybe even in other podcasts, is not particularly evidence-based. There are some few and far between exceptions, which I think is also a great conversation for another day. But if you're sitting down and going, okay, I've decided that I'm going to go gluten-free and Jordan has this episode on the top 3 things I need to think of, just remember that that decision to go gluten-free in the first place might have not been made with all of the right information in front of you. But either way, regardless of what you're starting to think about with respect to your nutrition, I think that this conversation is a really valid one, and often one that takes me a long time to have with people when I sit down with them one-on-one, which is why I thought it would make a perfect discussion for us to have together today in a setting. So first, me start by saying that studying nutrition is difficult. It's not impossible. So sometimes, again, you'll read online that it's impossible to study nutrition, and that's not true. It is possible to study nutrition. It's just difficult. And we have to think about it from a different lens than we think about research when we're studying something like a drug, right? Because when people enter a study on, let's say, Lipitor, right, the cholesterol drug, when people enter a study on Lipitor, the people who designed it, they select people who don't already take Lipitor, right? Like they would never let someone into their study who's already on the medication, because giving them more medication is probably not going to make them any better. And so they leave those people out of the study. They also leave people out of the study who are not going to benefit from the medication, right? They don't put people in the study who don't have high cholesterol. They also don't put people in the study who they think that are going to have harm from the medication either. So if we knew there was a group of individuals who were maybe going to have side effects or who the drug's not appropriate for, we would leave them out and we wouldn't study them at all. This is contrary to when we try and study something with nutrition. We cannot exclude people who eat vitamin C from a study on vitamin C, right? It's not possible. So everyone who enters a nutrition study has some level of what we call baseline status, meaning that they already ate the food before we tried to study it, or they eat a lot of other food. And so maybe us giving them some food that's healthy is being counteracted by the unhealthy food that they did eat, otherwise, right? So let's say we wanted to study olive oil. But when we give them olive oil, that comprises now like a very small percentage of their diet, and the rest of their diet is hamburgers. The benefit of the olive oil is going to be completely obstructed by the rest of their diet, right? Or if we gave someone who is Italian olive oil, They eat a lot of olive oil. And so now our little olive oil treatment for them is not going to show any benefit because we gave them a thing that they already did a lot of. Sometimes we can see this in those conversations or documentaries on things like the plant-based diet. When we look at the baseline status of the person in the documentary, they ate horrifically. And the treatment was to give them a lot of vegetables, right? So obviously they feel better, right? Obviously they run the fastest, half marathon they've ever run in their entire life. When we look at their diet before we decided to support them, it was terrible. And we gave them a lot of vegetables and now they feel really good. So studying nutrition is tough because we've got these things, we call them confounding variables, that get in the way of us understanding the true effect of what's going on, right? Who knows if feeding fish to people who live in Japan is going to be helpful? They already eat more fish than anybody else in the world. The other difficulty that we have, and this is the first thing I want you to think about when we start thinking about your diet changes, is what's called the replacement effect. So always when we give people something to eat, we are replacing something else in their life. And so if we give people more vegetables, they're eating less of something else. If we give people more olive oil, they're eating less of something else. If we gave people lots of hamburgers, they're eating less of something else. If we gave people nothing, they're eating less calories, right? And so every time we make some kind of adjustment in people's diet, it's either getting replaced by something or it's getting replaced by a calorie deficit. And so as you are sitting there trying to make that decision about doing something with your diet, you have to ask yourself what the replacement effect is going to be and whether or not that's going to be a positive change for you. Patients will often ask me about fasting, especially my female patients who are trying to lose weight to support their fertility. And the answer that I give them is that whatever solution we come up with, it cannot create more problems. And so for some women, when they fast, they feel great. They do beautifully well. They don't think about food. They eat an appropriate amount of food. They're not tired. They can, turn those hunger cues off at 7:00 and go to bed and live happily ever after. Whereas other women, when they try fasting, when they break their fast, they can't stop eating. They're exhausted in the morning while they're fasting. They can't stop eating at night, or they find that their food choices, are not actually filling them because now they're trying to squeeze all their nutritional needs in a very short window of time. And culturally, that's very difficult for them. So the solution can look simple and the same on paper, but when we present it in two different cases, that replacement effect, meaning what is it doing in your life or what is it replacing, actually doesn't meet our needs. And so we need to think about that. So another great example is when you take out a major food group or when you take out a major macronutrient. So let's start with major food groups. So there's some research on patients who have bowel disease and that they often will restrict the kinds of foods that they're eating because they don't feel well. And so by the time they land themselves in a specialist's office, they've often taken out a lot of food groups because they don't feel good, right? And they know that when they put certain foods in, they don't feel good, so they just take them out. The most commonly cited ones are gluten and dairy, but there are other foods that patients with Crohn's or colitis or even irritable bowel will eliminate on their own. As I always say, when we're out in the wild, so when those patients are out in the wild, they eliminate foods, like specific foods, out of their life because they don't feel good when they eat them. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what happened when they did that, right? What did they eat instead? Is it the food that they ate instead that made them feel better? Or was it the food that they took out that was making them feel worse? And that is a really hard question to ask if we never ask it, or it's a hard question to answer, if we never ask it, right? But because we live kind of in this culture of elimination, and elimination of the diet seems to be this goal that people work towards, especially women work towards, we often think about the elimination and not the inclusion. So if someone says they took out dairy and turns out what they took out dairy, they used to eat, say, yogurt for breakfast, they took it out and they've replaced it with oatmeal and berries and ground flax and soy milk. Well, it turns out that all of those foods are probably beneficial for their condition. right? So was it the fact that they took out the dairy, or was it the fact that they put in this other thing that was healthy? It's often that we will see patients restrict gluten with the hopes of having some weight loss. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what was the replacement effect? So if people take out gluten and they replace it with a bunch of gluten-free products that, equally are nutritionally the same, the same number of calories, same number of grams of carbs, um, definitely more expensive, we probably have a net of zero effect, and they don't see that much improvement, right? Versus someone who cuts out gluten and they replace all their gluten from their life with celery, they are going to see monumental shifts in their weight and their fluid retention, et cetera, which is why you can kind of like angrily sit in your cubicle and watch the person 2 cubicles over do a gluten-free diet and lose a ton of weight, and you try and do it and nothing happens, right? It's the replacement effect. It's what did you bring in instead of eating the food that you thought was a problem. So a good way to go about this when you're looking at a particular food that you are thinking that is challenging for you, or food that you would like to have less of in your life, is to think about it from that perspective specifically. And especially when we start to get into the third question that you need to ask yourself today in today's podcast. But, if you're looking critically at the foods that you eat and mapping them all out, and you've decided that one of them is villainous and it needs to be removed, and I'm not saying you're right or wrong, I'm just saying if this is the case, then you need to think critically about what food is going to be replaced with. Because sometimes we take food out and we replace it with something way healthier, which is great. Sometimes we take food out and we replace it with something equivocal, which means we probably shouldn't expect any kind of results from that. And sometimes we replace it with a food that is more harmful for us, or is not helping us meet our needs, or is moving us farther away from our goal. And so I want you to sit down when you have made that decision that you'd like to take something out. The great example is dairy, right? When people take out dairy, they replace it often with non-dairy milk alternatives. And we really, really have to ask ourselves the question about whether or not that's a healthier choice in every case. So often patients will come to me and say, well, I don't eat dairy anymore. I use almond milk. And when we go through the difference between a glass of milk and a glass of almond milk, or what's more common, because not a lot of adults will drink a glass of milk, that they've removed their yogurt or cottage cheese and replaced it with almond milk in some, in their smoothies, etc. But when we go sort of calorie for calorie, macronutrient by macronutrient, and then micronutrient by micronutrient, the non-dairy alternative milks are really not offering a lot to our patient. Beyond taste, like it's fine if you feel like you need something to put in your oatmeal that you want to taste kind of like milk or be a milk-ish product, then that's fine. But using it as a nutritional replacement for whatever you were getting from your dairy is not always going to be an equivocal or healthier choice. For some people, it's moving them farther away from their health goals, especially if one of their goals is to increase their protein. So that's what you need to think about if you're going to take out a specific food. You also have to have the same level of thinking, maybe even more thinking, if you're going to take out an entire macronutrient. So over the last couple of years, there's polarizing discussion around which diet is the best diet. And certainly there is a mild war between the ketogenic diet and a plant-based diet, each of them claiming to be the key to longevity, which is interesting because they're kind of diametrically oppositional to each other. Face value, and I know if you're listening to this, you can say, well, you can eat a lot of veggies when you're on keto and you can eat a lot of protein when you're on plant-based. I'm saying at its surface level face value for the rookie who's entering either of those two diet solutions, both of those diets manipulate macronutrients, meaning that you eat a lot more of one macronutrient in replacement of another. And again, we have to help ourselves understand what the impact of that replacement effect actually is going to be. So diets that are focused on plants and plant-based eating often is at the expense of some protein, which is not something that people feel overnight, right? You can get by without eating enough protein for one day, but it's when you've been doing that diet for 3 months, 6 months, that we would maybe expect to see some consequences of not meeting your protein needs, especially if a plant-based diet was not part of your cultural upbringing. There's a lot of learning that needs to take place to eat plant-based and meet all of your nutritional needs. However, patients do feel well when they start to replace their hamburgers with vegetables because, like I said at the beginning, most people's baseline intake of vegetables was really low before they started to go plant-based. And so they do feel some positive benefits from including all of that fiber and all of those antioxidants and all of the fruits and veg into their life. But we have to remember that it was at the expense of something else, and that will show up at some point in time in a patient's health. The ketogenic diet's the opposite, where it increases the fat intake of the diet and decreases the carbohydrate intake, often to, minuscule amounts. Again, we have to ask ourselves the question, is that solution, is the replacement of those carbs with those fats actually a solution that that particular person needs? I know for myself personally that I cannot get filled up very well on a 60 to 70% fat diet. For me, like that scoop of avocado doesn't really cut it. I can't build the satiety that I need from my food in the absence of carbs. It actually also doesn't work well for my particular exercise goals for me to have zero carbs in my life. At times when I've been the least successful with my nutrition, meaning that I struggled with weight maintenance or management, struggled with appetite regulation, and then on top of all of that, struggled with fatigue, is when I had the lowest amount of carbohydrates in my diet. And I know that's just me, and lots of you listening may thrive on a low-carb diet. But again, you need to ask yourself what it is about the diet that actually was positive for you and what the replacement effect actually brought in when you started to eat that particular way. Is it the absence of carbs that was making you feel better? Or is it the inclusion of those healthy fats? Because often what we'll find over time, patients like to gravitate towards rules, to give them some guidance and give them some clarity on what they should be doing. But interestingly, over time, what happens is that they realize what kind of flexibility they need to live within under those rules to actually meet their own personal needs. And so maybe their diet needs to be plant-based-ish or low-carb-ish in order to meet what their actual needs are, and to acknowledge what that replacement effect kind of has in their life, that actually it's the inclusion of such and such, not the exclusion of carbs, that makes me feel the best. And then we can focus on those inclusions in the diet much easier. So that's the first thing I want you to think about when you're starting to consider changing your diet. It's called the replacement effect. So what are you eating? What are you not eating, right? When you bring these rules in, when you bring in this diet change, what are you doing? What are you not doing? Because they're equally as important. And yet we kind of always focus on the thing we removed from our diet, not the thing we brought in. And like I said, they're both having a positive impact. And there's lots of times where it's the thing we brought in that's weighing in as having the most positive impact. And yet, because we live in the culture of deprivation, we always think about the thing we took out as being the most important, right? If you ask someone about their diet, right? Like, how do you identify what's your diet? They'll say, I'm something free, right? I don't eat this. I don't eat that. Very rarely do people identify with the foods they do eat, right? And think about how different you would feel about your nutrition if the way you identified with your nutrition was about the thing you included, not the thing you excluded. The second thing I want you to think about when you're starting to contemplate nutrition change is around sustainability. And this is not a new topic for us in the podcast. We've got lots of discussion over the years about sustainability and nutrition and the importance of it. And I feel like this is one of those things that people can realize is important, they say is important, and yet, right? And I think it's because our challenges around our discussion around food and body composition and body image run so deep. This is one of those things that we can easily say we believe, and yet we don't practice very often. So when we talk about sustainability, what we're looking for is dietary habit change. We're looking for building habit change in patients that are there for so long that they're less likely to be disrupted by your life changing or by, obstacles or stress. That's actually what we mean by sustainability. It means that the cost of what you're doing is something you can do forever. If you cringe every time you pick up a loaf of gluten-free bread because of the cost, we need to think about that. Right? If you live in an area that is a little bit of a, food island where you don't have access to certain fruits and vegetables or certain particular foods, we need to think about that before we set ourselves up for failure. The sustainability of what you're doing is really, really important, because if you can't imagine your life without a particular food, right? If you can't imagine your life without cheese, I was going to say coffee because there's a coffee sitting beside me and I feel like, but I'm not even willing to imagine my life without coffee. So that's not a good example. But if you had to imagine your life without cheese or without, your mom's apple pie, or if you had to imagine your life without bacon, why are we setting ourselves up for this kind of failure where you're not going to have that food for some sort of like undefined period of time? And as I say that, I know you're sitting there thinking like, yeah, that makes total sense. But if I want to lose weight, then I can do without it. Or, but if right? Like you still probably have some oppositional thoughts to this idea that this is a bad idea, that we take food out forever, or that we create rules that, in and of themselves are really not that sustainable. So when we talk about diet change and pattern of behavior, the goal that we have with you is that you could sustain the change more days than not over a reasonably long period of time. So most of the studies that have looked at nutrition that have any kind of endpoint that we really care about. So, and I'm not just talking about weight loss, I'm talking about reduction in diabetes scores. I'm talking about a reduction in cardiovascular disease. I'm talking about improved fertility rates in women. The minimum length of those studies to see this like clinically relevant improvement where the patient knows they're better, the doctor knows they're better, the lab work looks better, is about 6 months. And so if starting today, you could not take cheese out of your life for 6 months, then we better figure out how to teach you how to leave it in and yet still hit whatever your health goals actually are. And sometimes that means we need to make other shifts, right? If people want to keep in cheese, then it's about learning, well, what role is cheese playing in your diet? How many calories does cheese take up in your diet? Is there something else that you can eat less often if you're going to eat cheese more often? Let's talk about your movement strategies and how often you're exercising. And are you willing to exercise more so that you can keep that cheese in? So you can see it's a pretty dynamic conversation. And I'm not promoting that you can just do whatever you want at all times and everything will work out just fine. I do think if patients have health goals that they want to move towards, then those conversations about the pros and cons of those foods is certainly helpful. All I'm saying is that the rules that suggest that the food is evil, that you're terrible if you sprinkle some Parmesan cheese on your pasta, like that's the part that really has to go, because we see no benefit or no evidence in the literature that those kinds of rules actually create long-term sustainable change for patients. And I'm totally getting ahead of myself because my number 3 was talking about the point of rules over the long haul. I'm blending my 2 points together. So I'm going to come back to the rules. Let's regroup and chat about the sustainability piece for a moment. So knowing that sustainability is the key, that means that patients need to go through some kind of learning process about their nutrition, about themselves. It needs to be this intentional and reflective and process-oriented work that we do around nutrition, which is why I personally am not really a fan of these sort of 2-week diet fix type programs, because we already know what's going to happen on day 15, right? You go, well, thank God that's over. That took me 1 billion hours to cook all of these meals that I made myself this week. And you go back to eating your grilled cheese and tomato soup or whatever it was that you ate before that satisfied you or made you feel happy. So it's rare when people embark on these nutritional journeys that they do it in the sort of slow, stepwise approach that they really need to take to have sustainable change, right? So if you imagine that, like on your very first time you went out running, you completed a half marathon, you would be destroyed by it, right? Like you would be in bed, your muscles would be bleeding on the inside, and you would take so long to recover, and you'd probably swear off running for the rest of time. And that's often what people do with these nutrition plans, right? They're like gung ho, go buy all the food, do all the shopping, get all the Tupperwares, do all the stuff. And 15 days in, it's the equivalent of having run a half marathon with your nutrition. And you hope that you never have to look at bone broth or whatever it was that you cultivated at home on your stove for 1 million hours to make one meal. Like literally, right? And I know I'm exaggerating, but I'm sure we've all had this experience that you can kind of laugh at as you're sitting there thinking, we've all done it. We've signed up for the nutrition thing that literally takes over your life for 15, 21 days. And when it's over, you have to get takeout for like 10 days in a row to try and just emotionally recover from the trauma of having to stick to this plan. And so when we're talking about sustainability, the things we do know about sustainability in the research is that the changes that you make need to make sense, which means that we need to teach you why you're doing it. You can't be slipped a piece of paper that says, do this. The research is really clear. If we hand someone a pamphlet, some people do it, lots of people don't. If we educate people about what's in the pamphlet and then they still take the pamphlet home, they do better. So there needs to be some kind of learning that is going along with that change that you're making. So if you are embarking on some kind of change, then there needs to be some kind of understanding for you about what that bigger picture is. You can't say in your head, well, I'm going to take out dairy just to see what happens, or I'm going to try and eat a few more vegetables because I'm pretty sure that's what I'm supposed to do. You need to be able to connect it to the higher health goal that you have so that you can see the reason to follow through on it. When we understand what the big picture final outcome is going to be, we have a much easier time showing up day in and day out to actually practice the habit. So we know you need to get it, right? We know you need to understand it. And we also know that you need some level of accountability. Now, there are studies where it's literally an app that just checks in and says, hey, did you do the thing you were supposed to do? And people do better. There are studies where a nutritionist or a dietitian calls people once a month and say, hey, did you eat the food? And they say yes. There are studies that look at much more intensive nutritional support. And obviously, the more accountability, the more connection, the more responsibility that people feel in their own health plan, the more successful that they are. But that relationship piece actually shouldn't be ignored. And if you're floundering around going, well, maybe I'll try this, well, maybe I'll try that, and none of those things end up being particularly sustainable for you, the piece that you might be missing is the relationship piece. I went to a great mastermind conference a few years ago when we could do things in person and talked to some of the, really high up VPs at Precision Nutrition. And we talked about technology because they were asking me about my practice and what that looked like and what, the evolution of my practice was going to be. And they were talking about the use of technology. And so we got into a really great conversation about whether or not we could replace the coach, right? I say in air quotes, the human with technology, right? Is it going to get to a point where, with artificial intelligence or whatever it is, apps that are smart enough to check in with you, and, them being like the largest nutrition consulting company in the world, it was interesting to hear their answer that the people were never going to go away. They realized that there was a role for the human-to-human interaction in nutrition and that was almost impossible to replicate. And this is a company that will have the access to create any kind of technology platform that they wanted, right? But they know that that connection and that commitment comes from the human being, not from the computer. So part of that sustainability plan for you needs to include what's your accountability model, right? Are you doing this with your family? Are you doing this with a friend? Are you doing this with a practitioner? Because I'll tell you, doing it by yourself and then, white knuckling it through Pizza Fridays with your family while you eat spaghetti squash is not something that can happen over the long haul. So there needs to be some kind of support system that you develop as part of your nutrition goals so that you can actually make that sustainable. And then the other piece is this sustainability from a time perspective. So I, get almost teary watching new moms try and embark on some kind of online nutrition program that encourages them to make, a million meals for themselves day in and day out, and don't accept the lasagna from your mother-in-law because that's not on plan. When, if we think about the time and the bandwidth that these women have for change, like I'm just really happy if they have a glass of water and a bowl of cereal, right, in those first couple of weeks. So we need to take a step back and look at what sustainability means from a timing perspective. And for some patients, the benefit in their nutrition plan comes from just increasing the frequency of some behaviors and decreasing the frequency of other behaviors. And that actually is what is the most sustainable choice that they can make. We all have that, like peanut butter sandwich in a hockey arena kind of day in our lives, whatever that is. We just can't do it 5 days a week, right? And hit our nutrition goals. And so what the role of, some kind of nutrition change, or if you're sitting back thinking, I really need to make a change, map out what your week looks like and circle in red pen the things that are maybe not ideal, and ask yourself what level you could bring those things down to within some level of reason. If you're in a hockey rink 5 days a week, but really only one of them is over the dinner hour, then let's make that the peanut butter sandwich night, and the rest of them, let's pull together some kind of other meal. So I want you to think about sustainability from a time perspective too, because when you bring in new habits, and they're really arduous, so they take up a ton of time, they are the most likely thing to get dumped when your life gets busy. So if making your own bone broth, if grinding your own flax seeds sets your soul on fire, then do it, right? But if it's adding time to an already time-stressed scenario, then we need to think of ways to help you make that more sustainable or more easy. That also goes for like that, that term, hit the easy button. In weeks where it is challenging for you to meet your nutrition needs because of outside circumstances. There's nothing wrong with meal delivery a couple of times, right, in order to meet your nutrition needs. And I mean those meal delivery services that like cut up your vegetables and bring everything for you and you just heat it up in a frying pan. Those kind of delivery services. I didn't mean like takeout. But there's nothing wrong with doing those things sometimes or in moments of distress, right? Where you still want to hold your nutrition as a high value for you, but the sustainability of you being the person who's doing all the cooking and all the chopping isn't working for you at this particular time in your life. There's nothing wrong with putting the responsibility of preparing the meals down and just bear the responsibility of eating the meals, because that can also help that sustainability. So the questions you kind of want to ask yourself is, can I do this on my hardest day, right? If you look forward in a month, what your hardest day looks like, is this something that you can do on your hardest day? And if it isn't, then can you do some of it on your hardest day? Or can you get help on your hardest day to still meet those needs? And if not, then we really do need to examine what's happening with the nutrition goal in the first place. Or does the goal become do really, really well when you can, and when you don't, we don't care? There's lots of ways to look at it, but I'm saying from my experience that when people embark on diet change, it feels so black and white, right? And that's also part of what calls into question the sustainability of it, is that if you eat your mom's apple pie, that's it. You're not doing the Whole 30 anymore. You're not doing whatever challenge you've chosen. When the reality is you just literally ate a piece of pie and you can wake up tomorrow morning and you're fine. It's that black and white mentality that I think that keeps people from just moving forward in their nutrition journey and prevents them from learning. Like, how did I get to this place at 4 o'clock when I've blacked out and eaten a bag of salt and vinegar chips? If we can't look at that with some compassionate curiosity, then we never get anywhere. But instead, we sort of hold that bag of chips and feel so shameful about it that we have a really hard time correcting course the following day. And the last thing I want to address is this idea of rules, which I love having this conversation with women about their nutrition, is about the purpose and the role that rules are playing for them. I got so excited about it. I started talking about it like 10 minutes ago in this episode because I see a high connection or correlation between the concept of sustainability and the concept of rules. If you're thinking about making a change to your nutrition and your opening line is, from now on, I'm going to X, right? And whatever that is, I'm going to include this, I'm going to exclude that, I'm going to do this so many times, I'm going to do that so few times. I need you to stop and think for a minute about the role that that rule is playing for you and whether or not that's actually helping move you forward. And I know if you're interested in nutrition, if you love this topic and these things, that's an icky feeling to have to sit back and examine, because so much of what we do in nutrition is about rules, right? It's about yes, this, no, this. I'm encouraged online about a culture of, some freedom and flexibility in diet being presented. I'm encouraged by that, but I still think that most women are sitting at home going, I see that, but I can't do that, right? And women will often report to me like, I hear what you're saying about the rules, but I am black and white. I need the structure. I need the rules. So they see, right? They can maybe see why someone else would benefit from not having those rules, but they want rules to go along with their nutrition. And we're going to have some conversations over the coming months about things like intuitive eating and whatnot. And so I do think that this conversation is going to keep evolving. But for you specifically, thinking about this diet change that you're hoping to make or that you would love to be able to stick to, I want you to think really deeply about what that rule is and why it's serving you. Or if it's not serving you, right? And emotionally, perhaps the rule is creating confusion. Perhaps the rule is creating nutritional confusion, right? Because if you say, never dairy, but now you have a hard time hitting your protein goals. Or if you say never gluten, and that means that now, there are certain foods that you're including that are maybe not helpful for you. Or you're saying never carbs, but you're fatigued and not willing to kind of examine that. That's what I want you to think about with why those rules, like why do you need those rules to be there? So I have a few thoughts about this. And one of them is that I think we've used the rules in nutrition to try and make learning like less important, actually. I think we've kind of said, you know what, nutrition is too complicated for you to understand. So trust me, just follow these 3 rules, right? Because it's too complicated for me to explain why this food is good or bad. It's too complicated for me to have you think about your food too hard. And so instead, I'm going to give you these rules. So I think we've done people a big disservice by bringing in the concept of rules, because what that's done is that it's almost absolved us from this responsibility of learning how to fuel ourselves. And every week I meet women who are in their 40s and 50s who don't know how to feed themselves, or who are confused about the rules, or about, they've never learned what protein is or isn't, or how much is on their plate, or how much should be on their plate. And they've lived, half a century without learning this information. And the rules that we've given women about nutrition for the last 50 years have really prevented women from leaning in and learning about what their actual needs are. And I think that's done a huge disservice. So I want you to think about the rules that you're kind of latching onto and why you have them and what kind of bigger purpose they are serving. And I also want you to consider what kind of learning or concept are they hiding, right? What is hiding behind that rule so that you can better understand it? I personally don't have a lot of food rules. I don't drink alcohol as a rule. I'm completely sober. I think I'm coming up on 4 years. I am coming up on 4 years in February. That's just a hard and fast food rule. That rule makes sense for me. That rule, off to be perfectly honest, makes sense for a lot of women. There are no nutritional benefits from alcohol. It is a known carcinogen. We've talked about this on the podcast and other episodes. I highly encourage you to go listen to that episode I did with Erin Thorne on alcohol in women. So that's a hard and fast food rule. Now, beyond that, I don't have any food rules. And I have gone through many, many times in my life where I've had lots of food rules. I've had rules about grains. I've had rules about dairy. I've had rules about gluten. I've had rules about organic. I've had rules about carbs. I've had rules about macros. I've tried all of the rules, and the rules in and of themselves were not particularly helpful. It was the learning about nutrition in those moments that ended up creating the long-term sustainable understanding and change that was helpful. And I'll say, at the times when the rules were the highest, my health was the lowest. And I don't think that's a coincidence, right? Yes, circumstantially, those were also difficult times in my life, but they were also ones where I refused to be flexible in my nutrition for various reasons, and not always to my own benefit. Didn't always see the connection between my fatigue and underfueling on carbs. And when I looked back on what the role that some of those rules were playing for me, it was like I was using the rule to try and will myself into having better habits. It was like if the rule wasn't there, that I was just going to like stick my head in a bowl full of candy and be unable to control myself. And so I needed those rules to create guidance and clarity. When the reality is that those rules were there to try and help support better habits. So I want you to think about what those rules are doing or not doing for you, right? If you've created a rule around food, when you think about the change that you'd like to make, if you're using like qualifiers like always, never, more, sometimes, try and help yourself understand what you mean by that and what kind of outcome you're looking to have. If you are going to say, I never want to eat gluten, why is that? Is that because after you eat pizza on Friday nights, you feel kind of gross on Saturday mornings? Is it because you feel like you're realizing that you're relying really heavily on quick carbohydrates in your diet and you need to shake things up a little bit? And by temporarily creating a rule for yourself, you're hoping to engage in better habits. I just want you to think about it critically, about why those rules are there and what your hope is with them over the long haul. Because if the rule is there to help you build habits and the goal is future habit formation, then maybe it's not a bad thing for you, right? But if the rule is there to and it's blocking you from really understanding your needs, if it's blocking you from maybe nutritionally getting what you actually need, which is very common. I now never eat animal protein, right? In air quotes, is blocking many women from getting enough protein in their life. I just want you to think about that because I think that goes a long way, that reflective process. So just to recap what we've chatted about today, it's that if you're going to make nutrition change, this needs to be as reflective of a process as it would be to work, like if you were going to tackle any other kind of project. And I've talked about this in other episodes, how I think that health change needs to be tackled like project management, right? Where you sit down and you look deeply at the problem and you examine all of the solutions and you look at where you need to hire support for your project and you look at timelines and dates and deadlines and you reflect on that as you move through it. I actually want nutrition change to be that project management mindset for women so that they can actually move towards an end goal of some kind of food freedom and health achievement that meets what their actual goals are. It's when we're grasping at straws, when we create unsustainability, when we have a replacement effect in our life that actually doesn't serve us, then those nutrition changes are not actually moving you forward, right? If you are creating rules for the sake of creating rules. If you're creating rules and you're doing that so that you don't have to think so hard about your nutrition, my argument is that that's actually moving you backwards, because the goal should always be better understanding. It should always be about reflection, and it should always be about us tweaking or individualizing our plan so that it is sustainable and it creates habit formation for you that you can carry forward through your hardest days. That's what I want nutrition to look like for you. So now that we've got all the way to the end of this episode, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have goals. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have aspirations nutritionally. What I'm saying is that I want you to do it in a stepwise process that has intent, that has reflection, and that has some infrastructure. Because too often I watch women go through nutrition change where the goals are high, the infrastructure is low, the change is dramatic, and the end result is emotional difficulty for those women. And I want that culture to change where women can have a bad week and not feel like a terrible person, or women can shift their goals over time and understand how to change their nutrition to meet their needs. That's my goal for you, is that you actually deeply understand what nutrition is, what your body needs to fuel itself, and that you have some of the tools and the support for you to actually move there. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their healthcare. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their healthcare. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.